The air in the old house was still, the only sound the distant hum of a creaking floorboard. As Sarah and Jack unpacked the last of their boxes, they felt a mix of excitement and relief. The new house was finally their home. But what they would uncover in the basement would change everything. Hidden beneath the floorboards, they discovered a trapdoor leading to a long-forgotten tunnel. What started as a simple curiosity would soon reveal a secret too dark to ignore. What they found down there would haunt them forever. Jack and Sarah Thompson had spent the last few months searching for the perfect place to call home. After years of living in cramped apartments, constantly moving due to Jack's job and the rising cost of living, they were ready for a fresh start. When they found the old Victorian house on the edge of town, they knew it was the one. It was big, a little rundown, but full of character. There were fireplaces in every room, antique fixtures that seemed to whisper stories from the past, and wide windows that let in just the right amount of light. It was exactly what they needed. Sarah was the first to fall in love with the house. The thought of owning something so historic, so full of potential, was too good to pass up. And Jack, although more skeptical about the idea of dealing with endless repairs, was drawn in by the idea of having space to spread out, finally a place for their books, their old furniture, and room for their future together. They had just finished moving in, boxes scattered across the floor in every room, when they both felt it, a sense of something unspoken in the house, as though it was waiting for them to uncover something. Sarah dismissed it as the normal feeling that comes with moving into an old home, but Jack couldn't help but wonder about the house's long history. He had heard rumors from locals that the house had a troubled past, stories of past owners who'd mysteriously disappeared or gone mad. The house had an undeniable charm, but it also had its quirks. The floors creaked in strange places, and the air always felt a little too still in certain rooms. But that didn't deter them. They were ready to begin their new life, and the house, despite its peculiarities, felt like it could be the perfect backdrop for their future together. As they began to settle in, Sarah stumbled upon an old map in one of the boxes. It had been tucked away inside a dusty leather-bound book that they had found hidden in the attic. The map appeared to show the house's original layout, with strange markings in the basement area. It piqued her curiosity, an old, forgotten part of the house, hidden from view. Little did she know, that seemingly innocent discovery would lead them straight into the house's dark, forgotten past. It was a late afternoon when Sarah first noticed the trapdoor. She had been unpacking some old books in the living room when a strange draft caught her attention. She glanced around, confused by the sudden chill, but it wasn't until she looked down that she saw it, the edge of a floorboard that looked slightly out of place. It was subtle, almost hidden beneath a thick rug. At first, she thought it was just the wear and tear of an old house, but something in her gut told her it was more than that. Curious, she knelt down, running her fingers along the edges of the wooden floor. As she did, she found the latch small, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. The wood was old and fragile, but with a slight push, it creaked open. Beneath it, a narrow staircase led down into darkness, a cold gust of air rising from the depths below. Sarah's heart raced. She had heard stories from the neighbors about hidden rooms and secret passages in old homes, but she never thought she would discover one herself. She stood still for a moment, uncertainty flooding her mind. It was tempting, dangerous even, but her curiosity got the better of her. Sarah called for Jack, her voice barely above a whisper, as if the house itself might be listening. "Jack, you need to see this," she said, her voice trembling with excitement and trepidation. Jack appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on his pants, his brow furrowed in confusion. He had been busy unpacking in the kitchen and hadn't noticed Sarah's absence. When he saw the open trapdoor and the darkness beyond, a chill ran down his spine. "Are you sure we should be messing with this?" Jack asked, a hint of concern in his voice. His skepticism was clear, but Sarah's excitement was contagious. "I don't know, but look at it, Jack. This place." "It's hiding something," Sarah replied, her eyes wide with wonder. Without another word, Jack walked over and peered down into the dark opening. "All right, but we should be careful. You don't know what's down there." He hesitated for a moment, but then, driven by his own curiosity, he took the first step down into the tunnel. Sarah followed closely behind. The air grew colder as they descended, and the faint smell of damp earth mixed with the mustiness of long-forgotten walls. The stairs creaked under their weight, adding to the eerie atmosphere that seemed to envelop them. When they reached the bottom, the tunnel stretched out before them, a narrow, stone corridor lined with cobwebs and dust. The stone walls were cold to the touch, and the air felt heavy, almost oppressive. The tunnel seemed to go on for an eternity, the flickering light of their flashlights only illuminating a small portion of the vast darkness ahead. "How far do you think this goes?" Jack whispered, his voice low, as if speaking any louder might disturb the quiet that surrounded them. "I don't know, but we have to see where it leads," Sarah replied, her voice filled with a mix of excitement and nervousness. They continued forward, the sound of their footsteps echoing eerily in the narrow passage. As they ventured deeper, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just exploring a forgotten part of the house. Something felt off about the tunnel, like it was never meant to be discovered. The further they went, the more oppressive the air became, and the weight of the silence seemed to press in on them from all sides. Eventually, they reached a door at the end of the tunnel. It was old, covered in layers of dust and cobwebs, but the intricate carvings on its surface were unmistakable. It looked as though it had been untouched for centuries. Jack reached for the handle, but as soon as his hand made contact with it, a strange shiver ran through him. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. At first, Jack thought it was just the sound of the house settling, but then he heard it too, a soft, barely discernible whisper, as if something was calling out from the other side of the door. He froze for a moment, hesitant. "What do you think it is?" he asked, looking over at Sarah. "I don't know, but we can't stop now. We have to know what's behind the door," Sarah said, her voice determined. With one last glance at each other, they both pushed the door open. The hinges groaned in protest, but the door slowly creaked open, revealing what lay beyond. The room was small, but filled with old, mysterious objects, tattered books, faded portraits, and strange symbols etched into the walls. In the center of the room, a stone pedestal stood, on top of which rested a small, dusty chest. Sarah and Jack stepped forward, their breaths held in anticipation. Jack reached for the chest, but as his hand touched it, a sudden jolt of energy ran through him, and he pulled back, startled. He could feel the weight of something ancient and powerful in that room, a force that seemed to pulse with every breath. "What is this place?" Jack whispered, his voice filled with awe and fear. Before Sarah could respond, the whispering grew louder, and the shadows in the room seemed to shift. Something was watching them, something that had been waiting for them to find this hidden room. The room was silent now, save for the thumping of their own hearts. Jack and Sarah exchanged a glance, both sensing that this was no ordinary discovery. It was as if the house had been waiting for them to find this hidden room, to uncover the secrets it had kept buried for so long. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and Sarah could almost feel the weight of something ancient pressing down on her shoulders. "Jack, we need to be careful," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper as she took a cautious step forward. "There's something wrong about this place." Jack nodded but didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the chest in the center of the room. It was small, made of dark wood, and engraved with intricate symbols. The carvings were unfamiliar to him, but they felt old, older than anything he had ever seen. Something about it felt like an invitation to open it and discover what lay inside. But before he could take another step toward the chest, a chill ran down his spine. The air had become colder, the once stale atmosphere now thick with something else, something unsettling. It was as if the room itself was alive, breathing with the two of them. Sarah felt it too. She could see the goosebumps rising on Jack's arms, and she felt her own skin prickle with an icy touch. "Do you feel that?" Sarah asked, her voice low and trembling. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat, pounding faster as she looked around the room. The walls seemed to close in on them. Jack, always the skeptic, shook his head. "It's just the draft. This place is old, Sarah. It's bound to have strange things happening. Let's focus on what's in that chest." But even as he said the words, Jack felt a growing unease. The whispers had stopped, but something more dangerous had taken their place. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and there was a faint noise in the background, a scraping sound, like nails dragging across stone. He could hear it in his ears, but when he turned to look, there was nothing there. "Let's open it," Sarah said, her voice strangely calm despite the fear that was clearly written on her face. "We came this far, Jack. We have to know what's inside." Jack hesitated but then nodded. His hand, trembling slightly, reached for the chest. As soon as his fingers brushed the surface of the wood, a jolt of energy shot through him, a surge of cold that almost knocked him back. He yanked his hand away, startled, his breath coming faster. "What the hell was that?" Jack gasped, looking at his hand as if it had been burned. "I felt it too," Sarah said, her face pale. "It's like it's alive, like it's waiting for us." Jack took a step back, the fear finally creeping into his voice. Maybe we should just go back upstairs. I don't think we should mess with this anymore. But Sarah shook her head, her curiosity driving her forward. No, we have to know. We have to understand what's going on here. What if this is the reason the house feels off? We can't just leave it unexplored. Jack wanted to argue, but he couldn't bring himself to. There was something about Sarah's conviction that made him want to go along with it, despite every instinct telling him to turn around and run. Taking a deep breath, Jack reached for the chest again, his fingers brushing the edges more cautiously this time. This time, the chest didn't shock him, but the lock, it clicked open on its own. The noise was soft, but it echoed through the room like a gunshot. The lid of the chest creaked slowly, as if reluctant to open. Sarah held her breath, her hands trembling, and Jack opened it. Inside the chest lay an assortment of old items, brittle parchment, yellowed photographs, and a small, ornate key. But what caught their attention was a single, large, and decaying book at the bottom of the chest. It was bound in a dark, rough material, its pages nearly falling apart. The title, embossed in faded gold letters, was barely readable, but Sarah could make out one word, cursed. Ben's hand shook as he lifted the book from the chest. The weight of it felt unnatural, as though it was heavier than it should have been. He felt an overwhelming urge to open it, but Sarah grabbed his wrist, stopping him. Jack, we need to leave this alone. This feels wrong, Sarah said, her voice tight with fear. She could feel the room growing colder again, the whispering that had stopped earlier starting up again, faint and eerie. But Jack, his curiosity piqued, ignored her plea. He opened the book to the first page, revealing a series of strange symbols, ancient, twisted shapes that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. The text was in a language neither of them understood, but something about it felt familiar, almost as though they had seen it before. As Jack continued to flip through the pages, Sarah began to feel lightheaded. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift. She stepped back, her heart racing, feeling as if she was being pulled into the book itself. The room seemed to close in around them, and before she could say anything, Jack suddenly froze. Sarah, look at this, Jack said, his voice barely audible. The last page of the book contained a drawing, an eerie, dark figure that seemed to be watching them. The figure was distorted, as if caught in a moment of transformation, and there were symbols surrounding it, symbols that matched the ones on the walls of the hidden room. A chilling realization hit Sarah. That thing in the drawing. It looks like the thing that's been following us. Jack looked up at her, his eyes wide with fear. What do you mean? I don't know, Sarah said, her voice shaking. But whatever this book is, it's connected to everything, this house, the tunnel, the thing that's been haunting us. Before Jack could respond, the whispers grew deafening. The shadows seemed to move with purpose, their shapes distorting as though they were coming to life. In the flickering light, it became clear the house itself was reacting to what they had uncovered. The ground beneath them shifted, and the walls groaned. The tunnel was no longer just a forgotten passage, it was a doorway to something far darker, and they had just opened it. Jack slammed the book shut, his hands trembling, but the room did not quiet. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the very walls of the house were closing in around them. Sarah's pulse was racing. Her head spun, and she fought to keep her feet beneath her. The whispers had returned, now louder and more distinct, though she could not make out the words. It was as though they were being spoken in a language foreign to her, a language she had never heard but somehow understood. Jack stumbled back, dropping the book onto the stone floor with a hollow thud. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch unnaturally, curling and twitching as if they were alive. He looked over at Sarah, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and fear. The warmth of the house was gone, replaced by an oppressive cold that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. We need to get out of here, Sarah whispered, the words barely leaving her lips before the ground beneath them seemed to shift. The floorboards groaned as though they were alive, and the walls creaked, their ancient bones shifting. She could feel a pressure building in the air, like the house itself was holding its breath. But Jack was frozen in place, staring at the open door of the hidden room. His eyes were fixed on something that wasn't there before, a dark, nearly imperceptible figure standing at the threshold, its shape slowly becoming clearer as he focused. The figure was tall and thin, with unnaturally long limbs and eyes that seemed to flicker in the dim light, glowing faintly. A twisted smile stretched across its face, as if it had been waiting for them all along. Its eyes locked onto Jack's, sending a shiver down his spine. Jack, Sarah cried, reaching for him, but he didn't respond. His gaze was locked on the figure, and she felt an overwhelming sense of dread creeping over her, suffocating her. We need to go now. But Jack didn't move. "It's not real," he whispered to himself, though his voice shook. "It's just a trick of the light. Just a shadow." Sarah stepped forward, her breath shallow as she grabbed his arm. "No, Jack, it's not a trick. We need to leave." The figure didn't move, but its eyes followed them as they backed away, its presence growing stronger. A cold gust of air rushed through the room, sending papers and dust swirling into the air. Sarah felt an icy chill settle over her skin, and suddenly, she was struck with the overpowering sense that they were not alone. The house seemed alive with malevolent intent, as if it was trapping them in its grip. Without thinking, she yanked Jack away from the doorway. "We need to go now," she shouted. Her voice was sharp with panic, and finally, Jack snapped out of his trance. He blinked rapidly, looking around in confusion as if coming out of a fog. He nodded quickly. "You're right, Sarah. Let's get out of here." But as they turned to leave, the whispers grew louder, closer. They were no longer just in their heads. The sound was coming from all directions, reverberating through the stone walls, growing more intense with each passing second. The air was thick with an invisible force, pushing them back into the room. "No, no, no," Jack shouted, as the temperature dropped even further. He could see their breath, visible in the cold, and the tunnel seemed to stretch on endlessly, the walls closing in around them. Something was blocking their escape, and they both knew it. Suddenly, the shadows seemed to surge forward, wrapping around them, pressing against their bodies. A hand, cold as death, brushed Sarah's arm, and she screamed, jerking back. But when she turned to look, nothing was there. "Sarah," Jack called out, panic rising in his voice as he grabbed her by the arm and pulled her toward the tunnel's entrance. But the tunnel had changed. The once narrow passageway seemed to have expanded, growing wider and longer, a seemingly endless void stretching ahead of them. The door to the hidden room slammed shut on its own, the sound reverberating in the silence that followed, leaving them trapped in the darkened tunnel. They couldn't see beyond a few feet in front of them, the air too thick to breathe, the space too confined to escape. The whispers had become voices, clear, distinct, and unmistakably angry. "We are trapped," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with dread. She felt as though the walls were closing in on them, that the house was suffocating them. "What do we do?" Jack asked, his voice strained. "How do we get out of here?" Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she struggled to breathe. She looked around desperately, but all she could see were the darkened corners of the tunnel, the flickering light from their flashlights revealing only a sliver of the truth. Something else was down there with them, something that had been waiting. Suddenly, Sarah's flashlight flickered, dimming, before going out completely. She gasped, and in that moment, the shadows grew stronger, stretching farther, engulfing the tunnel in an impenetrable darkness. She reached out, clutching Jack's arm as fear surged through her body. The air was thick with the feeling of something watching them, something ancient and powerful, and it was closing in. "We need to leave," she whispered frantically, but as Jack tried to move, the ground beneath them began to rumble, and the walls of the tunnel shook violently. A low growl echoed from the depths, sending a shiver through both of them. "We're not alone," Jack whispered, his voice trembling with realization. Suddenly, there was a noise, a low scraping sound, followed by a louder bang. The door to the hidden room burst open, and something moved in the darkness beyond. It was too late to escape. The house had claimed them, and there was nowhere left to run. As Sarah and Jack stood frozen, the room suddenly went completely silent. The oppressive air, the eerie whispers, the growls, everything stopped, leaving only the sound of their own breathing. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, his breath shallow and quick. His mind raced, trying to process what was happening. What is this place?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. The moment the words left her lips, the ground beneath them trembled again, though much more softly. Then, from the corner of the room, a faint light flickered to life. It illuminated a large, cracked mirror that Jack had not noticed before. The light seemed to draw them toward it, as if beckoning them to look. Something in that mirror, something about its unsettling stillness, pulled at Sarah's thoughts. They cautiously moved toward it, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. As they approached, they saw the reflection in the mirror shift. It wasn't their own, at least, not entirely. The reflection showed their faces, but it also revealed the room they were in, and the thing that stood behind them. It was a dark figure, tall and imposing, cloaked in shadow, its form not entirely human. Its face was twisted, its eyes glowing an unnatural green. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp teeth that seemed to smile menacingly. The mirror showed nothing but a void where the figure's body should have been, like it had no true form, only darkness. "Turn around," Jack whispered, the words catching in his throat. But Sarah couldn't move. Her body was frozen in place, eyes glued to the figure's unsettling grin in the mirror. Slowly, Jack reached for her hand, urging her to look away. "It's not real," Jack muttered, his voice shaky. But even as he spoke, doubt gnawed at his certainty. The figure in the mirror was watching them, its eyes locked onto theirs, its grin widening. Without thinking, Sarah reached toward the mirror. The moment her fingers touched the cold glass, she gasped. The figure in the reflection did the same, its hand slowly rising toward hers. The glass beneath her fingers rippled as if it were water, a strange energy coursing through the room. "Sarah!" Jack cried, grabbing her arm and pulling her back. "Don't touch it. We need to get out of here now." But it was too late. As Sarah pulled her hand away, the mirror began to crack, a low, guttural sound emanating from within. The room shook violently, as though the house itself was awakening from a long slumber. The walls groaned, the floor trembled beneath their feet, and the air turned even colder, as if something inside was alive, stirring in response to their intrusion. Suddenly, the mirror shattered with a deafening crash. Glass shards flew in all directions, and a loud, scraping noise filled the room. Sarah and Jack shielded their eyes, but when the dust settled, they saw the figure standing before them, no longer confined to the reflection. It was real. It had crossed into their world. It was like nothing they had ever seen, a towering, monstrous creature with long, thin limbs and eyes that glowed like burning coals. The room was filled with an overwhelming sense of dread, as though the very air itself was alive with hatred. The figure slowly advanced, its movements jerky, unnatural. It didn't speak, but Sarah could feel its presence in her mind, its intentions clear. "Run!" Jack shouted, his voice hoarse with terror. He grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her toward the tunnel, but the creature moved too quickly, blocking their path. Its eyes gleamed, and in that moment, Sarah understood. This thing wasn't a mere shadow, it was something bound to the house, something ancient, something tied to the tunnel they had uncovered. With no other choice, Sarah and Jack turned and ran toward the farthest corner of the room, where a narrow passage seemed to lead to another part of the house. The house groaned around them, as though it was closing in. The creature followed them, its claws scraping against the floor like nails on chalkboard, its shadow stretching behind them. They reached the narrow passageway, and Jack pushed the door open, only to find another hidden room, this one far darker and older than the last. But as they stepped inside, they realized the door had locked behind them, sealing them in. The passageway was no longer an escape, but a trap. The walls seemed to close in around them as the creature reached the door, its twisted smile now a grotesque snarl. "Why is this happening?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky, her eyes wide with panic. "Why is it chasing us? Why is it?" Before she could finish, a loud, sharp noise echoed in the room, the sound of something moving beneath the floor. The creature's grin widened even further as the ground began to crack open, revealing an ancient, stone altar below. Sarah's eyes widened in horror as she understood. The altar wasn't just part of the room. It was part of a ritual that had been left unfinished. And now, they had unknowingly awakened it. The altar was where the creature had been bound, trapped, forced to remain hidden beneath the house for generations. But now, the barrier that had kept it contained had been broken. The dark force that had been imprisoned beneath the house had been freed, and it would not stop until it had claimed them both. "The book," Sarah whispered, recalling the ancient text they had found earlier, the one with the strange symbols. "This house, it's cursed. The book was the key. It was meant to keep us out." Jack turned to face her, his face pale with realization. The house was never meant to be just a home. It was a prison. Sarah and Jack stood frozen, their hearts racing as the ground beneath them continued to tremble. The ancient altar beneath the floor seemed to hum with a dark energy, its presence overwhelming. The creature that had once been confined to the shadows now roamed free, its glowing eyes locked onto them with a hunger that could not be denied. The room felt smaller, suffocating, as the air grew thick with an oppressive weight. "We need to get out of here," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible, as if speaking louder would only draw the creature closer. He reached for the door, but it was locked. Panic surged through his chest as he tried to force the door open, but it refused to budge. The creature moved closer, its long, spindly limbs creaking with each step, its twisted smile never faltering. Sarah could feel its presence pressing in on them, suffocating them with an eerie calmness that chilled her to the bone. It wasn't just a physical threat. It was something far darker, something that seemed to permeate every inch of the house. "Why is it still here?" Sarah gasped, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she backed away from the altar. The creature was getting closer, its blackened eyes fixated on them as if it knew they were its prey. We need to leave this place now, before it's too late. Jack gripped the door handle with both hands, his knuckles white with the effort, but it remained stubbornly locked. A low growl rumbled from the depths of the creature's throat as it moved closer, its eyes flickering with a terrible, ancient malice. The whispers had returned, louder than ever, swirling around them, echoing in the corners of the room like a chorus of voices calling for them. "Jack," Sarah cried, her eyes wide with terror. "We're not getting out of here. It's not letting us leave." Suddenly, the lights flickered and then went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. The cold was unbearable, and the whispers grew louder, as though they were right next to them. In the pitch black, Sarah felt a hand brush against her arm, cold, icy, and impossibly thin. She screamed, jerking away, but there was nothing there. The creature's growl vibrated through the air, so close now it felt as if it was breathing down their necks. Sarah's chest tightened, her heart pounding in her ears. It was as if the house itself had become a living, breathing entity, its walls closing in on them, trapping them in its unrelenting grip. "We need to fight back," Jack shouted, his voice now filled with urgency. He scanned the room in search of something, anything, that could help. The altar, the symbols etched into the stone, they all seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if the house itself was feeding off their fear. "We don't have a choice," Jack continued, his eyes wild with panic. "We have to make a choice. We have to finish whatever was started, or it will never stop." Sarah's mind raced. "What do you mean? Finish what was started?" she asked, her voice trembling with dread. "The ritual," Jack muttered, his gaze shifting toward the altar. "The book, the symbols. It all makes sense now. The house, the creature, the tunnel, it's all part of something that was never meant to be disturbed. We have to figure out how to stop it, before it's too late." But even as Jack spoke, Sarah felt the temperature drop even further. The cold was unbearable now, seeping into her bones, making it impossible to think clearly. It was as though every corner of the house had become alive with malevolent intent, every shadow watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. The creature's movements grew faster. It was no longer creeping toward them. It was charging, its limbs twisting unnaturally, its grin widening, showing sharp, jagged teeth. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat as it lunged toward them, its eyes locked onto hers, its presence overpowering. It was no longer a matter of survival, it was a battle for their very souls. "Jack, help me," Sarah screamed, but Jack was already moving, his eyes wide with terror. He grabbed the book, still lying on the floor, its pages now glowing faintly with a supernatural light. The creature snarled in frustration as Jack turned the pages, desperately searching for an answer. "I think I found something," Jack shouted. "It's a binding spell. It's the only way to stop it from coming through. We have to recite the words." The creature screeched in fury, its form distorting as though it were being pulled in multiple directions. It could feel its hold on them weakening. Jack's hand shook as he recited the words from the book, his voice trembling with fear, but every syllable seemed to make the creature recoil, its body twisting unnaturally. "Sarah, help me," Jack shouted. "We need to say it together, or it won't work." Sarah, her legs trembling beneath her, stepped forward, her voice shaking as she joined Jack in reciting the incantation. As they spoke the words together, the house began to shake violently, the ground beneath their feet trembling as though it was coming apart. The creature howled in fury, its form flickering and warping, its screams filling the room with an unbearable noise. But as they continued to speak the words, the energy in the room shifted. The shadows in the corners began to dissipate, the air grew lighter, and the coldness that had once consumed the space began to lift. Slowly, agonizingly, the creature's form began to break apart, its twisted body fragmenting into nothingness. The last shriek of the creature echoed in their ears as the final words left their lips. The house groaned and shook one last time before the silence settled in. The oppressive weight that had clung to them lifted, and the air felt warmer, less suffocating. They had done it. The creature was gone. But as Sarah and Jack stood in the aftermath, the room now eerily quiet, they couldn't shake the feeling that the house still held its secrets. They had stopped the creature, but had they truly ended its reign? The questions lingered in the air, unanswered. The silence that followed the creature's disappearance was deafening. For a moment, Jack and Sarah just stood there, trembling, their bodies soaked in sweat. The house felt different now, quieter, almost too still. It was as though the air itself had been stripped of all its weight. They exchanged a glance, each of them processing the terror they had just endured. They had survived the creature's attack, but the questions were beginning to pile up. What just happened? Sarah breathed, her voice still shaking. Did we really do that? Did we stop it? Jack couldn't answer right away. He was still staring at the book, which now lay open on the floor. The pages, once glowing, had now returned to their faded, yellowed state. The eerie energy that had filled the room seemed to have faded, leaving only the cold remnants of what had occurred. The house, however, was still heavy with a lingering sense of foreboding. I don't know, Jack admitted, his voice tight with disbelief. But I think we've just scratched the surface of something much deeper. Whatever was here, it was never meant to be disturbed. This house, it's not just old. It's part of something bigger. And I'm not sure we've ended it. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. She had been hoping for a sense of finality, something to reassure her that the nightmare was over. But Jack's words only deepened the pit of unease that had settled in her stomach. She turned toward the door, the same one that had once sealed them in the tunnel, and found herself staring at it for a long moment. Something about it was off. She could feel it in her bones. The creature might have been gone, but the house was still hiding something. We need to get out of here, Sarah said, her voice firm but laced with fear. We need to leave before whatever's left here decides to find us again. But Jack wasn't moving. He was still standing in the center of the room, looking down at the altar, his face pale. Sarah followed his gaze, and her heart skipped a beat. The altar, which had seemed so dark and oppressive only moments ago, now appeared almost ordinary. But something was wrong. There were new symbols etched into the stone, symbols that hadn't been there before. Jack, look, Sarah whispered. The symbols, they're different. They weren't like this before. Jack moved closer, his eyes wide with shock. He traced the unfamiliar markings with his fingers, his breath shallow. The markings seemed to pulse with a dark energy, shifting ever so slightly as though they were alive. Where did these come from? Jack murmured. It wasn't like this when we were here before. Something has changed. Suddenly, the room grew colder again, and the air became thick with the presence of something dark. The floor beneath them trembled as the house seemed to groan in protest. It was happening again. Something was stirring beneath the surface. The walls seemed to contract, and the shadows along the edges of the room began to twist and writhe, as though they had been awakened once more. Jack, Sarah cried, panic rising in her voice. We have to go, now. Before Jack could respond, the ground shook violently. The stone beneath their feet cracked, sending fissures running along the floor. The altar cracked open with a deafening roar, and from it, something began to emerge, a dark, swirling form that seemed to take shape, as though it was drawing energy from the very room around them. It wasn't the creature they had faced before. No, this was something more ancient, more powerful, a force that had been bound within the walls of the house for centuries. Sarah could feel its malevolent presence wrap around her, squeezing the very air from her lungs. We can't outrun it, Jack said, his voice hoarse with fear. This house, this thing, it's alive, and it's not letting us go. The swirling mass of darkness solidified into a figure, a tall, gaunt shape draped in shadows, with piercing, glowing eyes. It was not human, not by any stretch of the imagination. It was a thing of pure malevolence, something older than the house itself. The figure spoke, its voice like 1,000 whispers combined into one terrifying sound. You have broken the seal, the figure hissed, its voice cold and dripping with hatred. You have released what was never meant to be free. And now, you shall join me in my domain. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as the figure reached out toward them, its hands elongated, claws sharp and glistening in the dim light. The shadows around it seemed to stretch and coil, as if they were alive and responding to its commands. Sarah felt the pull of the darkness, as if it was drawing her in, swallowing her whole. We have to finish what we started, Jack said, his voice shaking but determined. We can't let it take us. We have to stop this. Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with fear. How? How do we stop this? Jack looked at the book once more, his mind racing. There had to be something in it, some way to banish the darkness that had been unleashed. He remembered the ritual, the incantation they had recited before. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to use it again, finish what had been started, and finally seal whatever this thing was back into the darkness it came from. With newfound resolve, Jack grabbed the book from the floor, flipping through the pages with shaking hands. The creature's eyes never left them, its grin widening with each passing second, as if it relished the fear in their eyes. Sarah, help me, Jack said urgently. We have to recite the words together again. We can't let it win. Sarah nodded, fear and determination battling within her. The figure lunged toward them, its claws slashing through the air, but they were ready. Jack and Sarah stood side by side, their voices shaking but strong as they began to recite the incantation once more. The words tumbled from their lips, and as they spoke, the room began to tremble once again, the shadows writhing in agony. But this time, the shadows began to recede. The air lightened, and the figure let out a deafening scream, its form distorting and unraveling as the energy from the ritual coursed through the room. "This time, it will be enough," Sarah whispered as the house seemed to give one final, shuddering groan. The air crackled with tension as the shadows continued to writhe and twist around Jack and Sarah. The house groaned, as if it were alive, shifting with every breath they took. The ancient incantation echoed in the room, reverberating off the walls and shaking the very foundations of the house. The creature, or whatever it was, screeched in agony, its form flickering in and out of existence, its once solid shape breaking apart with every word of the spell. But even as the words rang out, a gnawing realization began to creep into Sarah's mind. The creature was weakening, but it wasn't vanquished yet. The ritual they were performing was powerful, but it required something more, something beyond just words. They had awoken something ancient, something deeply tied to the fabric of the house. And now, to truly rid themselves of it, they had to make a choice, sacrifice everything and risk their lives, or live with the knowledge that this entity would forever haunt them. Jack's voice shook as he recited the final lines of the incantation. The creature's form flickered, its shadowy figure twisting violently, as though it was trying to break free. The light in the room flickered with each pulse of energy, growing brighter, then dimmer, like a dying star. "Sarah, listen to me," Jack gasped, his voice strained. "We can't just banish it and leave. The house, it's part of this curse. We either sacrifice something to end this, or we'll always be connected to it. The house won't let us go. It'll follow us." "What are you saying?" Sarah asked, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The weight of Jack's words hit her with full force. She felt the coldness in her bones, the sinking feeling that maybe, just maybe, they hadn't truly won yet. "We have to choose," Jack said, his eyes wide with realization. "We either destroy it completely, cut off its tie to this house, but doing that means we might not make it out. Or we leave, and we live with it, knowing that it's always there, always watching. We live with the possibility that it'll come back, even stronger." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, her mind a swirl of conflicting thoughts. She could feel the pull of the house, its dark energy still seeping into her bones. She looked around at the room, at the stone walls that seemed to pulse with life, and at the altar that had once been the source of their torment. The air felt heavier than ever, as though the house was holding its breath. Jack turned to face her, his eyes searching her face. "I can't do this alone. You have to make the choice, Sarah." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, the weight of the decision almost too much to bear. She looked at Jack, seeing the fear in his eyes, the fear she shared. They had already come so far, risking everything. But was it enough? Could they defeat the darkness once and for all? The creature's form flickered one last time, its twisted smile widening. The whispers began again, louder than before, drowning out everything else. Sarah could feel the house pressing in on her, its walls seemingly closing in tighter with each passing second. The shadows grew thicker, colder, until she could barely breathe. Suddenly, she knew what needed to be done. It wasn't just about defeating the creature, it was about breaking the curse that bound them to the house. She had to sever the connection. She had to make the ultimate sacrifice. Jack watched her with wide eyes, but Sarah didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, her hand moving toward the altar, her voice barely a whisper as she spoke the final words of the incantation. She could feel the energy shift, the temperature plummeting even further as the house seemed to push back against her. The shadows around them began to pulse with dark energy, as though they were alive, writhing in agony. The creature howled, but its voice was distant now, as though it were being pulled back into the abyss. The walls cracked and groaned, and the floor beneath them began to split apart. The very foundation of the house trembled. "Sarah, no," Jack cried, reaching for her, but it was too late. She had already made her choice. With one final cry, Sarah placed her hand on the altar. The ground beneath her feet cracked open, and a blinding light engulfed the room. The darkness recoiled as the light grew, pushing it back, tearing at its hold on the house. The shadows shrieked in fury, but they were fading now, consumed by the light. Sarah felt her body tremble, the light overwhelming her senses. Her vision blurred as the force of the magic surged through her, the power of the house fighting against the ritual. The air seemed to crackle, and for a moment, she thought she might lose herself to the darkness. But then, just as quickly, everything stopped. The light faded, leaving the house still and silent. The air no longer felt oppressive. The oppressive weight of fear, the creature's presence, and the darkness that had surrounded them were gone. But Sarah's heart was heavy. She could feel the sacrifice she had made, the weight of it pressing down on her. She had severed the connection, but the cost had been great. She wasn't sure if she could ever escape the memories of what had happened. She wasn't sure if she would ever truly be free. Jack knelt beside her, his face pale with exhaustion. "We did it," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "It's over." But Sarah knew, deep down, that the price they had paid would follow them. The house might have been silenced, the creature banished, but they had both made a sacrifice they couldn't undo. The house had been defeated, but the consequences would linger, haunting them forever. The house was quiet now. The darkness had receded, leaving behind only the remnants of a battle fought in the shadows. But for Jack and Sarah, the real question lingered: what happens after you've faced the unspeakable and made a choice that changes everything? Now, we want to hear from you. What would you have done if you were in their shoes? Would you have made the same sacrifice to break the curse, or would you have taken a different path? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more chilling stories that push the boundaries of fear and fate.